to say not too bad. I'd have a hard time putting a number on it, but...
No, wait, you know, I asked every mayoral candidate to grade Bloomberg, and everyone would do it but Chris Quinn, and I don't think you want to be in the same boat as Chris Quinn, so I want a number.
7, with an asterisk for my ignorance of some of the details. But I think there were major issues in the city this year that, by and large, were communicated or reflected, and that people were concerned about inequality, especially in the Democratic primary, and that was reflected in you know, the issues that the candidates tended to raise around it. Stop and frisk obviously broke out. De Blasio earlier made hay with the paid sick leave pressure that he put on Christine Quinn. And I think where the press often falls down, and did again this year, is in looking beyond the hot button issues that the candidates are raising because they know there's a lot of passion around them. So, you know, were there deep dives in the media on the complexities of developing affordable housing and a million other things that you could name, development, not just affordable housing, but, you know, Bloomberg has said that his major legacy would be in rezoning the city as much as anything else. That was not really debated. You could get the candidates involved in a nice wonky debate about that if you were interested, but it's so crucial to the status and the future of the city, wasn't much discussed. So it was, you know, a lot of stop and frisk, a lot of paid sick leave, a lot of bike lanes. Then, of course, the whole Anthony Weiner thing was a distraction, and in the tabloids especially, that became really ridiculous and took so much of the air out of the room and took time away from the serious debate.
That's true.
So that was the worst thing. Okay,
Anthony Weiner was the worst thing.
Okay, you wanted a number, I'll give you a number. I'd give it an 8. I think we collectively earned that 8. It wasn't earned, I think, till sort of the closing months of the campaign. I thought the best thing that people did was they shut up. I mean, there were dozens, there were scores of debates. I think there had to have been over 100 debates among the mayoral candidates if you include the primaries. I mean, I wrote something about it when, you know, I just, in passing, asked Bill Thompson, gee, how many debates have you done? He said, oh, I don't know, I've lost track, maybe 40. And this was in, like, February. You know, I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy, but I saw a lot of you. I saw Andy Hawk. I saw a lot of people out there humping around, you know, and doing their best to try to get to all of them and try to make sense of them. And it's a grueling schedule, and the resources weren't really what they should have been, I know, in most people's organizations. And I thought we did a good job collectively of trying to keep track of what was said and try to keep the thread going. I agree with Brian that there was not enough. And you know, it might be related to this, but there was not enough of the media really putting issues front and center that somebody in that organization knew needed to be front and center. You know, just because everybody wants to get together and have a sort of a primary bash fest, you know, attacking, say, John Rhea from you know, the chair of the Housing Authority. That's not an excuse to ignore the accumulated $14 billion capital deficit that is at the root of the problem there. And when people, when confronted, because in a couple of these debates that I moderated, I asked them, I said, look, there's a $14 billion problem here. What do you plan to do about it? And they give you, you know, what was frankly a literally inadequate answer. They'd say, well, NYCHA pays the NYPD to patrol public housing developments, and they have to transfer $75 million a year to the NYPD. I'll put an end to that. And it's like, well, you know, I'm no math major, but, you know, you might as well set up a lemonade stand in front of the projects. You know, I mean, you're not coming anywhere near the dimensions to actually solve this problem. I don't think collectively we did enough to sort of put a hard stop on some of that stuff and say, look, on this issue, on record homelessness, on what's going on with NYCHA, on a couple of different issues. It's not enough to just give the answer that will get you a round of applause in this forum at this night, and we're not just going to report that. So that was a continual frustration throughout the campaign, including the debates that I moderated. It was unfortunate. And there's a million different reasons. Everybody's doing their job the right way, but collectively, it let some issues escape the room and escape public attention, and that's too bad.
Joel?
I'm going to be really unpopular and say probably 5.5.
Or realistic?
Yeah. I think the media collectively ignored, not ignored, but misread the mood of the electorate, did not get the whole de Blasio phenomenon until de Blasio was basically mayor-elect. He really had no scrutiny until the very end game. And I think it's a fundamental misreading of the way politics is played in New York. I think collectively the media saw 20 years of Republican and Republican independent rule and thought that was the norm, where the norm really is, this is a city that voted 80% for Barack Obama. It's a very liberal city, and we all sort of, I believe, misread how serious a contender Bill de Blasio was from the very beginning. I don't think he got the scrutiny from the beginning that Chris Quinn got or Bill Thompson got.
So what did we do? That was what bad we did. In a way, it's going to be self-evident, and it certainly dominates my list of questions. But what did we do good?
I think, there was some amazing stuff done. Video, the Times did some amazing things with graphics, and certainly the Chris Quinn documentary was a fascinating piece of work. Having worked at ABC News, it was network worthy. It was a really strong piece of journalism that shows the power of video to do things that are very hard to do with print. I thought the immediacy of this campaign, the quick relaying of information, the blogging that was done, everybody tried to do some sort of if you were interested in where a candidate stood on horse-drawn carriages, you could find that information. I mean, you might not find a story in your paper, but there were places to go for the information. If you were an issue voter with something that was driving your vote, you could find that information. So I think just the growing use of technology, the use of video this year really stood out in my mind.
I'm gonna go with, I guess, what is the general consensus and give it an 8. I mean, yeah, I think in general we all did a very good job, and as Errol said, there were a huge number of people, a huge number of outlets covering the race. I think the best thing that we did was, I think reading the coverage, by the end of the race, you had a good sense of the really interesting sort of paradoxical dynamic in this year's election, which was that a lot of people thought that the city things were going pretty well and liked a bunch of Bloomberg's policies, but at the same time they wanted a change. And another sort of half of the people or of the voters were angry and wanted a change. But this kind of collective desire for a change, even while plenty of people liked many of Bloomberg's policies and thought that the city was on a pretty good track. So that was sort of an interesting contradiction, and I think the media did a really good job of exploring that, and I think as Brian said, sort of talking about the issues that were really emotional, like stop and frisk. I think that, as other people have said, we didn't do as good a job at getting the candidates to talk about the really intractable policy issues, many of them budget issues that they didn't want to talk about. They were asked many times, what are you going to do about the expired union contracts and the desire for retroactive pay? And their answer was, I'm not going to negotiate in the media. And we never sort of got past that. And so how de Blasio is really going to deal with the budget and handle those things, we don't know.
Maggie, you're just in time. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well did the media do covering the election? What was the best and worst thing they did?
We're grading compared to the coverage of other elections, or just on the Senate?
Whatever objective.
7. I mean, I think that the best was. I think that there was appropriate coverage of Chris Quinn, given her position as a front runner. I think there was far too much coverage of Anthony Weiner, and that was across the board, and I don't think I'm saying anything that's original. I think that de Blasio, at least, and Joel could probably speak, and may have already, speak better to this than I can.
Yes, he did.
But I think de Blasio is very, to my memory of an incoming mayor, is pretty undercovered. And I don't like the word vetted, because that suggests that our job is to do something that it isn't necessarily. But I do think that he is coming in as one of the least scrutinized mayors in recent memory, and I would say that Bloomberg was one of them, frankly, in '01 in terms of certain positions, because he was just so not taken seriously for so much of that year. So the focus was on his money, or on his gaffes, or on him calling for the Lord's Prayer in schools, and there was a lot less on issues positions. But he was more aggressive in terms of promoting certain policies. I think that's it. And I just think, I mean, the overwhelming coverage of Anthony Weiner from start to finish, which we were all guilty of, was not a high moment.
So, you know, I would take maybe a little bit different take. I don't agree necessarily with Joel that Anthony Weiner was a distraction.
I didn't say that.
I do.
Brian.
Sorry? Brian said Anthony Weiner was a distraction. Okay. You know, it's not the point for this conversation, but a reasonable people can wonder if Sidney Leathers had never materialized, would Anthony have imploded? And to that degree, it was pretty intense coverage of a guy who his trajectory was leading towards frontrunner status. Now maybe he would have imploded for one or another set of stories that eventually did get printed. I guess what they did right was, those of us on the outside, I think I saw a lot of what the future of journalism might look like. And one take on it was Anthony and Elliot Spitzer provided scandal and sex, and really you can't think of Anthony Weiner without thinking about sex. Sex drives clicks, sex gets eyeballs onto videos, and Anthony, it's not that Anthony was a distraction. Between May and Anthony's implosion, it's fair to say that the lesser campaigns, de Blasio and John Liu, fundamentally weren't covered. They had a very hard time, the campaigns had a very hard time getting reporters to cover their events. It wasn't the fault of the reporters, it's not the fault of the editors, it's not the fault of any one person. It's sort of a fault of the models of journalism. You know what works and you got to go with it. It's sort of at the expense of everything else. And you know, that's actually good, because it sort of shows us as a model of what could be happening in the future.
Doesn't sound good to me, and you didn't give me a number.
That was the good part. That was good. There's a lot that I agree with a lot about what could have been done better. I think there was very little. I would say betting, since Maggie of sort of perspectives of where candidates come from and what how their policies and their outviews and their approaches reflect sort of their larger needs, their political needs, their base, their donors, not the sort of quid pro quos, although that's important too, but sort of like the sort of, you know, how their broad outlook affects and benefits their supporters, because while everyone has supporters who are altruistic, and most candidates also have supporters who are not altruistic. I think there was very little discussion of that. There was very little consideration of sort of what a different approach was, and who will win and lose, not as citizens, but as capitalists in the city. And I too, look, I run a business, and I'm dependent on reporters. I have my biases too, and I have my needs, which is why I'll give it 9.
We know where that 9 came from.
Al, Stu just reminded me of why he's such a smart guy. Because the risk of not being an outlier, I'm going to have to echo the 9 for professional purposes. That said, I think you've got to look at this year as being a real reduction in some of the journalistic standards that we've held for years. I think the growing competition among journalists and the speed in which we need to get news and the number of blogs that are competing for content has changed the standard in which decides on whether something gets reported or not. I think that feeds a lot of the need. It feeds a lot of the sexiness that Stu talks to, but it doesn't necessarily make for better reporting. I think it's a similar thing which gave Chris Quinn a victory on paid sick leave without a real discussion on the compromise that it was. I think it was the same kind of seeking of sensationalism which, however self-servingly, gave horse carriages far more coverage than discussion of NYCHA policy.
Let's move to the second question. Did Chris Quinn get a fair shake from the media? You know, there's lots of controversy about the Times She's a Bitch story, which wound up resonating. Joel Aisha did an interview in which he referenced it. Did Chris Quinn get a fair shake or not from the media?
Yeah, I thought she got more than a fair shake. I mean, she was, if you talked to people, you know, if you were talking to people outside of the city, or talk to people who were sort of casual observers of the whole process, everybody assumed that it was a matter of, will she win outright, or will she place first or second in the runoff? And apparently, according to the Times, that great video, maybe she didn't even believe that up until the closing weeks. So I thought she, you know, it dovetailed perfectly with her strategy. She got puff pieces, that whole thing in New York Magazine that nobody else could lay claim to. She had the most powerful of the government positions if you wanted to just generate press on any given day. She had the Bloomberg administration, you know, sort of basically standing in for her or allowing her to stand in for them at crucial points. That got a little bit of attention. I think she had everything she wanted. I don't think the coverage was unfair at all.
Why? But the press clearly misread how narrow her support was, right? I mean, she
But that's a
completely
different question. But Greg, that's a different question than asking whether our coverage is good. There's a basic question, which is, do we overread the horse race polls early on, and do we look at what's actually in them? Which I can argue de Blasio's people did the smartest internal polling out of any operation, and I think that we don't, the public polling, which does random sampling, versus the voter file, which is what most of the campaigns do. And that's really where the issue is. But if we're going by what the standard has typically been of what coverage is, I mean, the idea that she's a bitch story, and that's your word, not mine, but the idea that that was some kind of an anomaly, that story was written about Rudy Giuliani, that story was written about Anthony Weiner in the 09 campaign, or 08.
And it was front page, for Anthony too, they couldn't not.
And a whole bunch of people will argue that for the 6 months prior to that story, she was given a huge ability to remake herself and distance herself from the Bloomberg hoax. And to Maggie's point, in our private polling, we had Chris Quinn at 40 in the first poll. But when we scratched the surface, she ended up at 15.
What does that mean? What do you mean when you scratch the surface?
What Maggie said was right.
Right, that it was totally fueled by name recognition.
No, that's not what
That, the early horse race polling was totally fueled by name recognition, and when you informed voters on her real positions, they left her in joy.
Stu?
Oh, I don't believe for a second that people just left Chris Quinn because of the micromillimeter of policy differences among her and the other candidates.
No, I really disagree with that.
Her policy is
What about policy?
look, people are complicated. Everyone's minds are complicated. My mind is complicated. You can at one point, you can on one hand have been angry or upset at the way term limits change and still vote for Mike Bloomberg, particularly running against a candidate 4 years ago who is a great man but is not an awesome candidate, or is a good man but is not an awesome candidate. You can be of two minds, and you can be angry about that situation, not take it out on Mike Bloomberg, but take it out on Chris Quinn, particularly when elections are a lot of things, not about a lot of things. They also are about a lot of things. Elections are a lot of things. One thing that elections are reminding the voters what they dislike about your opponent. And you can drive the term limit dialogue relentlessly, and that has you can't, it's complicated, Mike. you know, think of where we were as a city, think of where we've become since 2001, you're upset about term limits, but you still vote for him, or maybe you don't vote for him, but you don't really. And then there, you know, and then there's a lot of support for Chris Quinn, parent support for Chris Quinn that disappears right away because it's complicated, and you can't blame journalism for not getting that times 1.1 million.
Brian, you said you
I
disagree.
think, yeah, I mean, I disagree that there was only a sliver of policy difference. Maybe if we're in Texas, the difference between Chris Quinn and the other candidates here is a sliver. But I think these kinds of things matter, and there was enough. I think it relates to what somebody said earlier about the press misreading the anger of the public, which I do think happened, at least the voting public. And Chris Quinn misread the anger of the voting public. And
Mike Bloomberg's people did
it was easy for the others to associate her with Bloomberg by associating her with the term limits in a way that was very salient this year. I also think that the Times article on her leadership style made no difference whatsoever. And, you know, that people were rejecting Chris Quinn because of her record on the issues.
Well, I think that the article, you know, while I think that it was in line with articles that we did about male politicians, I think that the article did seem to, that reputation stuck to her in a way that it didn't necessarily become the defining thing about Anthony Weiner. And,
but I think
you know, you can argue whether that's
only to insiders, I think. I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was talking to somebody, I was on vacation in Europe and talking to somebody who's, you know, not American, and he said, oh, you're covering the mayor's race. Oh, right, there's a woman. She's the bitchy one. So
I mean, Giuliani was not exactly described as warm and fuzzy, and neither was Anthony
Well, I
Weiner.
think the point the Quinn people made is that those stories don't matter for men, they only matter for women.
And I'm not sure
Right.
that's true. I mean, I think it was also a problem for her because it tied into, you know, the fact that she had supported term limits and that she had made this very pragmatic decision to side with Bloomberg.
Well, in answer to your question, I'm going to go back to my original answer. The stories about Chris Quinn were not unfair. The difference, though, was that those stories were not done about the other candidates.
That's a really good point.
And that's the danger of being the front runner. There was a relentless barrage of stories about Chris Quinn, and we did not see those stories about Bill de Blasio. We did not know about the role of Shirlane until the very end. There were no stories about Bill de Blasio's record as public advocate until the very end of the race.
I mean, the other thing is that she wasn't just the front runner. She also had, as Errol said, the most powerful position. She actually had a record, whereas Bill has almost no record.
But that's my point. But he was a mayoral candidate, and there was an enormous amount of attention on her, and rightly so. But there was not the attention on Bill de Blasio because, A, I would argue that most reporters and most editors did not see him as that serious a threat at the beginning. And one other thing, you know, Mr. Levenson probably played one of the biggest roles in this campaign with a negative barrage of attack ads on Chris Quinn, which is totally, you know, valid. But I think that was a defining moment in the campaign when she was at 40%, and this fusillade of attack ads came on that she could not answer because of. You know,
she did.
I think Errol's next.
Yeah, is that she?
And you know, yes, Chris had enormous flaws, and Scott brought them out, and that was the beginning of the end for Chris Quinn. So, you know, she might have been destined for 15%, but you know, I'm saying it's all fine. That's politics, but Scott really helped change the course of this election with your
For the young political reporters in the audience, the two takeaways from this conversation that you should always remember. One, if there's $1 million of negative advertising aimed at a candidate and it goes unanswered, it's gonna cause some damage. It's gonna cause real damage, and that becomes a story that ought to be covered. The other thing is, you know, these same polls, and I said this relentlessly, you know, it's not really my place to sort of drive these kind of points, but I would always sort of try to put an asterisk on the poll showing her as a front runner, because those same polls showed her getting more black votes than Thompson, more Asian votes than John Liu, more union households than de Blasio. And so I would say, well, look, if you think that's the way it's gonna play out, then yeah, she's the front runner. But if you think there's something else going on here, and I don't know what it might be, you've got to put an asterisk next to this name, and you've got to assume that there could be what we later saw, which was a collapse.
Just a couple small points. Brian, I'm not sure at all that Chris Quinn and her team was blind to term limits. I just don't know that they had an alternative. I mean, it's it's been a while since, and I still don't see an alternative. It is what I mean. She was where she was. I can see one thing I can think of one thing they could have done differently. But other than that, the blindness. I do think, sort of, since this is a panel about journalism, Scott is important because sitting here as someone who really hasn't gotten over the Gore race, Clinton Gore race in 2000. I have sort of deep-seated views and feel that like every time a Democratic candidate says, as Anthony Weiner did in 2009, and as it turns out Bill Thompson didn't do, but it looked like he was for a few days, like maybe we don't want to count votes, maybe we do want to count votes, that pulls me very deeply. Similarly, when the Democratic establishment and the media en masse, none of you guys, although sort of Errol, are editorial board members, when it sort of failed to say, like, wait a second, corporate money, outside money is bad, the Koch brothers are evil, and $1 million from your donors, some of whom have very personal beefs against Chris Quinn, one of whom, or a couple of whom may actually have business and personal beefs against Chris Quinn. We're not going to sort of talk about that process. Maybe we didn't challenge the now mayor-elect on it because he was at the time irrelevant. But it was sort of like a big sort of issue out there, like, how come it's all, like, we're opposed to outside money, we're opposed to corporate money, except for when we're not. That's shocking that politicians act in their own special, their own interests to try and win an election. That's not really the problem. But
all right, let's move to the de Blasio.
So just
okay.
a little one on getting back to what Stu said earlier about people being complex. I don't think it was closeness to Bloomberg or term limits or any of those one issues. There was a packaging of Chris Quinn which eventually worked against her, and people abandoned her because they didn't believe in the essence of her.
De Blasio. Why did the press not pay attention to him? Was it just the polls? Was it, Joel keeps saying, Joel, you've said a couple times, well, there should have been this much coverage of Anthony, but more coverage of everyone else, but resources are limited, lots of candidates in the race, lots of issues to cover. How could the press have recognized de Blasio's surge earlier, or was it just impossible? Brian, you want to take a start?
How could they have recognized it earlier? I don't.
Did you have him on the show more later, or as much early on?
No, well, we were really doing, with the major 5 Democratic candidates, we were doing rounds. So we were giving them basically equal time and going in order as much as we could. There was a period of time where Chris Quinn wasn't accepting the invitations as readily as the others, where I think she was trying to play a little Rose Garden. So she got on a little bit less, maybe by 1 or 2. But we were, we were going mostly on a rotation. And we were having policy conversations primarily with the folks. Very little politics in those conversations. So we got a lot of de Blasio policy, a lot of his policy thinking on the table. Definitely failed to scrutinize his record in terms of management experience and stuff, but that's not what we were doing. We were doing primarily policy conversations.
Yeah, my blown call on de Blasio, and that's sort of private. It's not like I was out there, predicting anything, but where I think I just kind of misjudged and was surprised, and it's always nice to have surprises in this business, by the way, is I assumed ethnic voting patterns that I've spent my whole life watching were going to play out, except we have this wild card, this guy with a biracial family, multiracial family. So how does that play out? Is he a white candidate? Is he a black candidate? I don't know. It turned out he was a black candidate for voting purposes. But who could have known, I mean, and look, believe me, the Thompson people were just as surprised, I mean, and I know this because I was in touch with these folks and would sort of kick this around with them. It's like, you guys are assuming you're going to get the same level of black and Latino support you got 4 years ago, but there are other candidates in this race. How is this going to play out? And they didn't have an answer, and that's why they lost. you know, I thought de Blasio got the appropriate level of coverage, because let's keep in mind, his surge came late. It didn't come in the middle of July, you know. In fact, I remember after the Sidney Leathers scandal broke, Weiner dropped 14 or 15, and de Blasio went up 14 or 15. You know, I mean, it was exactly that. And it's like, well, gee, that looks pretty neat. Was it 1-to-1? No, not necessarily, but clearly there's a suggestion there that he benefited from the collapse of, and one last thing, I mean, the ethnic voting things in the wild card. Bill de Blasio. I asked him on the air, I said, look, do you wonder or do you worry that you might be too liberal for New York? That the things that you're talking about are just not where the city is? And he actually looked taken aback. And you know, this is what happens when you're a politician out on the street every day. He said, no. He said, that's the one thing I'm sure of. You know, he's like, it's, you know, when I talk about Tale of Two Cities, when I talk about the inequality, when I talk about the hard time people are having, that is getting a response. Now, it's not showing up in the polls, and I got a lot of things I have to do in order to put this campaign on track, but the core of what I'm doing is resonating. He never had any doubt about it, even though some of the rest of us did.
Anybody want to continue on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Errol said, the surge came late, and I think we recognized the surge as it was starting to happen. And I kind of disagree with the idea that de Blasio wasn't vetted, or that we could have done more to vet him or examine his record. I mean, you know, he didn't do very much as public advocate. We wrote about that fact, about the fact that it was an office where you don't, you know, have a very specific responsibility, and that he didn't do that much, or he did things that were kind of more for show than anything else, like his, you know, campaign against, on campaign finance issues. We looked, you know, extensively into his youthful enthusiasm for the Sandinistas. We looked into his plan to raise taxes to pay for pre-K and found that it didn't add up. You know, we looked at many aspects of both his background and his policies. And, you know, the fact is, like Obama, he doesn't have a lot of experience.
I mean, you gotta give credit where credit is due. The de Blasio folks ran a brilliant campaign.
They also benefited from luck. It was both. There was Anthony
listen,
imploded. No, but Anthony imploded, and they were ready, and they had positioned themselves to take
and
advantage of it.
You can't win a huge thing like this without luck and getting some breaks. But to Errol's point, they had a plan,
Yes.
they had a message, they believed in it, and they stuck to it. The other end of that is the only people who ran a worse campaign than Chris Quinn was Bill Thompson's folks.
Let me stay on de Blasio for a minute, because I understand that the surge was late, but the primary was September 11th. Today is November 20th, and I don't think we know that much more today than we knew at September 11th. There have been a few stories, but has the press really dug in since September 11th to try to figure out this guy and what he's going to do?
I mean, I think there's been a lot written about him, but it all came after the primary, and once the primary was over, I mean, the election was over. Loda was a horrible candidate. I think, you know, the days of electing a Republican, you know, might be over just because of the demographic changes in the electorate. And, I mean, David Dinkins narrowly lost in 93, he narrowly lost, and if there wasn't a referendum on Staten Island about secession, he might have won. Bloomberg, we all know how he benefited by the Democratic Party imploding for Mark Green, 9/11, and just an enormous amount of money, and he barely won. And I think that lulled a lot of people at the beginning of the race not to take de Blasio seriously. At the beginning of the race, there was enormous speculation. Who would Mayor Bloomberg endorse? As if that endorsement meant something. That was the collective wisdom. That endorsement really means something. And by the end of the race, you had Joe Loda, who didn't want to go anywhere near Mike Bloomberg. And to get to Scott's point, de Blasio, where I think he ran a brilliant campaign, I mean, there are a number of things they did well, but I think they read the electorate. They were onto the idea that people want to change before anybody else. The only other person was John Liu, and he was a discredited candidate because he had, you know, his fundraising problems, and he was just not a very credible person when he would make an argument. So I think that all that kind of combined, you had collectively the press didn't take de Blasio that seriously, and you had de Blasio reading the electorate better than any other candidate. And
he was also a very effective candidate on the stage,
yes,
and that's
I mean, when you go to that first debate on Channel 7, the first major debate, and that was the first time. I mean, even then, I don't know if a lot of people were paying attention, but it got, there were we co-sponsored it with Channel 7, 500,000 people watched. It was almost the middle of August, and a poll had come out that morning that showed de Blasio near 40%, and still the other candidates were attacking Chris Quinn. They ignored de Blasio, tactical mistake. And when you go back and look at that debate, de Blasio was just so much more polished than the other candidates. And when you look at how he performed against Loda, I mean, he was just a much better debater. He always got the last word in. He made the most of the arguments, the facts at hand. He was also a better candidate than
Stu?
I was going to sit this round down, but some of the more business-oriented civic people who are involved in civic life in New York or from a business side, from the very beginning thought it would be de Blasio, and a lot of us were very confused as to why he didn't take off. The obvious answer is because of Anthony. You can argue the oxygen, you can argue the anti-Chris, whatever it was. But we felt, let's keep in mind, Anthony didn't arise seriously until April. So, from December, January through the first quarter of the year, admittedly with very little coverage, we thought Bill was the only one who was coherent. I mean, I don't mean to insult Chris, but Bill was coherent, and Bill had a coherence and an eloquence that the others lacked. And we, some of us who were particularly invested in Michael Bloomberg, you wondered that, New Yorkers, they like quality.
I would add to that. I don't think it's a coincidence that you had some of the same people who worked on President Obama's campaign working on de Blasio's campaign in terms of messaging. But I also think that there is an interest in a lot of Obama's supporters in advancing the idea that there is a new progressivism coming, and if there is, he was the leader of that movement, and that's particularly important given that he is having a problem right now.
I'm always thinking about avoiding being used, and I'm not talking about unpaid internships. Politicians have a lot of pseudo events. They say a lot of BS. So, what are some examples you might be able to cite of politicians trying to use the media, and did they work?
I mean, on a daily basis, they're going to try that, Toby. I mean, the only real antidote to that is to have your own sense of where the narrative is going and where, and it's not out of bounds to talk with them and say, I'm not coming to this thing because this is really not what the story is. There's subtle ways to do it. I think I told you this when you were in my class, is that, if you're at a press conference and, it turns out that it was all a bunch of BS, you just put your pen down and just look at them. Don't take notes. I mean, try to convey to them, this is not what this exchange is supposed to be about. You're supposed to be talking about issues that matter in a way that matters with relevant, timely information. If they're not giving it to them, you've got to let them know.
If there's an event like that, then you can also do the story of why they're doing it. What's the motivation behind whatever they're saying, and that is usually a good story there.
I'll give you one example, but I think the general answer as a young journalist is they're trying to use you every single time they're having a conversation with you or somebody associated with them sends you an email. It's a business transaction. And that's not even to be overly cynical about politics. That's just their job, is to communicate their best foot forward to the media, or their most effective foot forward.
Reporters are often calling elected saying, I'm looking for somebody to say something like, to fill their thesis, to fill their hypothesis. And if they don't get what they want, that quote doesn't necessarily make it into the article.
New Yorkers deserve fair elections, but we have an incompetent Board of Election making incomplete voting tallies and making us use broken voting machines. And you're talking about tonight about scrutinizing government. The City Council approves or oversees the Board of Election Commissioners. Why don't you hold the speaker candidates who are now being vetted accountable for reforming the Board of Election?
there's an idea. We're going to be
Yeah.
moderating a speakers forum later this week, Thursday, 7 p.m. on the road to City Hall. And yeah, maybe we'll ask them that. Maybe we'll ask them that. I mean, you know, the Board of Elections is a very easy punching bag. You know, Mayor Bloomberg in particular, I think, has delighted in using it as a punching bag. You know, I don't know if under the circumstances they really deserve it, you know, and I think some of the coverage could probably be just a little bit better. Like we have, like everybody complained about the 6-point font, and everybody reported that. Very few people reported that under state law, we have this full-face ballot requirement where all of the names have to be on one ballot. And then we also have these machines where the paper can't be but so big. And so, you know, this is what lawmakers are supposed to resolve when you have these kind of conflicting legal requirements. But the last people you should blame are the functionaries at the Board of Election whose only job is to enact, in this case, conflicting laws.
They've sometimes had a strange interpretation of the laws.
Yes,